I've worked with Anat for years on several European grants on risk communication, and she's really at the head of the class in that particular arena. She is currently traveling, but we were able to get her to do her session pre-recorded, and I'm going to turn this over to get started. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Professor Anat Gesser-Edelsburg, and I'm very happy to speak with you today. I'm the head of the Health Promotion Program at the School of Public Health, as well as the founding director of the Center for Health and Risk Communication. Over the years, my research has focused on developing theoretical and applied models for health and risk communications, particularly during crisis. My book, titled Risk Communication and Infectious Disease in an Age of Digital Media, was published by Routledge Studies in Public Health in 2016. I also published many papers, including integrative studies, based on which I was invited to give a lecture at the WHO Training in Infodemic Conference on COVID-19. Today, I would like to present this issue of climate change through the lens of risk communication. I will briefly review the literature dealing with the field of climate action motivation. Then I will address the key variables that emerge in most studies. And finally, I will propose a hybrid model with action steps that suggest a tool to examine how the public and decision makers can move from words to action. In October 2021, the World Health Organization issued a report calling on decision makers across the globe to take urgent action regarding health crisis caused by climate change. In this report, the WHO describes climate change as the single biggest health threat to humanity. The greatest risk of climate change include its dangers of civilization and its potential as an important driver of natural disaster, drought, poverty, famine, food and nutritional insecurity, and global health problems. Today, there is mostly a consensus that global warming is real and caused by human actions. It is also clear, as announced by the Panel on Climate Change, that social and environmental systems can mitigate and adapt to climate change. Yet, there haven't been enough actions or commitment by policymakers to actively implement such steps, and as Greta Thunberg said, at the closing of the recent Glasgow conference. Words that sound great from our leaders, words that so far have not led to action. So the question remains, how will mitigating climate change be done? What practical steps will be taken? Who will actively take these steps, and who holds the main responsibility to take action? Let's watch Greta.
Zero by 2050, blah, 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 net zero, blah, 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 climate neutral, blah, blah, blah. This is all we hear from our so-called leaders. Words that sound great, but so far has led to no action. Our hopes and dreams drown in their empty words and promises.
There are three factors, at least, that contribute to the fact that there are so few actions taken. The first challenge is the issue of uncertainty in the rapidly changing nature of climate science and the policy context in which it must be operated. This presents new and urgent challenges for researchers. The second challenge is the lack of actual government actions to reduce the threat of climate change. We continuously see how declarations and commitments, for example, the Paris Treaty from 2015, are not implemented for a variety of reasons, including political agendas and leadership changes. The most recent Glasgow conference contributed this approach and did not achieve its goals. The third challenge is how to motivate individuals and politicians to commit to making the necessary behavior or policy changes. Given these challenges, there must be an effective risk communication strategy to help motivate the necessary behavior change among the public and turn the declaration into concrete actions. Risk communication is one of the areas that can help overcome the challenges of mitigating climate change on a global level. In risk communication, the focus is on the nature of the risk itself and the public's response to risk messages. The understanding is that risk communication is not just about transferring information and testing how the public understands climate change, but how it identifies risk perceptions and the public's concerns while referring to the political and media context of the time. The risk communication approach provides tools for eliciting public engagement. For example, simplifying complex information and technical language into language that public can understand to convey information effectively. Risk communication also provides tools to adapt information to different subgroups in the population, and that is why it's so effective. The big question is, who is the target audience of risk communication in this context? To whom do we need to communicate the risk and motivate to take action? Some argue that IPCC should target policymakers, which in turn are expected to communicate with the public. This is the wrong approach to take because policymakers and government policies are affected not only by expert opinions, but also by public opinion and that growing influence of civil society organization and grassroots activities. Policymakers will try to understand science only if the public says it is important. If the public appreciates leaders who value science, so even if policymakers fully understood climate science, their motivation to implement policies consistent with the knowledge will come from bottom up, the grassroots activities of the public. In risk communication, the literature addresses three main communication strategies. The first is persuasion, convincing individuals to change and adapt their own energy use. The second is mobilization, fostering collective action to change the behavior of individuals and institutes. And the third is deliberation, making joint efforts to identify problems and solutions. Implementing these three strategies requires in-depth understanding of the mental models held by the relevant audience. Without research to map these mental models and understand the variables that influence the public, organizations will not be able to construct an effective risk communication infrastructure to cope with climate change. I want to briefly go over the variables in the professional literature that deal with behavior change and motivations for action in relation to climate change and their importance in the context of risk communication. Demographics alone are ineffective predictors of global warming attitudes and practices. People are most receptive to content that is consistent with their own attitudes and beliefs. Therefore, the first variable emphasizes that communicators must consider the heterogeneity of their target audience and the use of a variety of internal and external psychological variables, including perceived social norms, perceptions regarding government's responsibility and trust in government, political attitudes, locus of control, and efficacy. Another variable that is central to our topic is responsibility. A study by Beck staff et al. Showed that public's ambivalence towards responsibility across all types of risk issues. This ambivalence can be tracked to citizen-state tensions and doubts about whether institutional actors will meet their obligations. Johnson found that participants saw attempts to recruit them for personal action as businesses and governments' denial of responsibility for the problem. There is also a strong connection between self-efficacy and green consumption, supported by research. Basil and his team found that self-efficacy triggered a sense of responsibility, which affected whether people adopted a recommended action. They believe that is both possible and effective to reduce the risk of climate change is essential for motivating a sustaining risk mitigation. Most of the literature dealing with behavioral changes in health issues, and not exclusively with climate change, focuses on the connection between attitudes, intentions, and actual behavior. But there is a problem with these models because they do not predict actual behavior due to the situational factors or barriers. These are factors that prevent actual behavior or actions in spite of good intention. Situational factors are hardly mentioned in the attitude models regarding climate change. Another promising tool for effective climate change communication that is the issue of the message framing techniques. Research shows that reducing psychological distance can also positively influence whether people become engaged with the issue of climate change, and that worry and hope are strong predictors of support for climate change policy. Additionally, framing climate change in a way that evokes emotions among a specific audience has the potential to trigger feelings. But there is research from 2020 that examined framing in the context of climate change and shows that the effects of framing may be limited or even contradictory. To summarize, research refers to commonly studied verbals that affect human behavior, such as norm, perceptions of risk, public trust, etc. Some verbals are used repeatedly as manipulative verbals. For example, the framing verbal and the literature indicates that it is important to include emotion as part of this framing. Yet there are those who claim that framing is not a strong enough verbal because it stimulates reality and does not reflect its reality itself. Therefore, it is very important to minimize the gap between attitudes, intention, and actual behavior. Another important verbal is responsibility. Posting the question how to motivate the public to take action by putting the responsibility on either the public and or the industry. It is still unclear as to where change will come from. And finally, the literature calls for creating a research infrastructure that will continue to examine the framing and responsibility verbals and introduce out-of-the-box thinking. We suggest indicating verbals of bottom-up instead of top-down, such as positive deviance approach that mitigate between intentions and actual behavior. The PD approach is a community asset-based approach that operates from the bottom up, from community, instead of top-down approach that are initiated by experts or policymakers. This approach identifies positive behavior practices in the community without external resources that other members of the community can adapt. For example, when you see someone in the community going to work in a carpool instead of their own car, or doing the wash in clothes instead of hot water, or minimizing consumption, such as buying second-hand clothing. Here you can see the design of our model that integrates the components that I mentioned earlier, and I will introduce now responsibility. The question is, what will have a strong effect? Joint responsibility on individuals and the industry, or exclusive responsibility on either individuals or on the industry? Our assumption is that people will be more likely to change their behavior if responsibility is shared by corporations and by individuals. If responsibility will be imposed only on them as individuals, the likelihood of them changing their behavior is particularly low. Top-down versus bottom-up. The question is, what is more effective, top-down or bottom-up instructions to mitigate climate change through action? Our assumption is that when practices and tips for solving complex problems emerge from the community, they are usually more creative, generate fewer objections, and are easier to implement. So the best way to transmit information to the public will be via the creative solutions suggested by the individuals within the community, meaning the bottom-up approach, and less effective via the top-down approach, where the authorities hand out guidelines and instructions. Framing. Here the question is, what is the best way to frame climate change? Via framing it as a national security issue or a health issue? Our assumption is that in countries subject to security threats, such as Israel, other threats such as climate change are not as significant. This means that the climate change crisis must be framed in a way that increases its significance. We suggest that framing climate change as a security issue will be more effective than framing it as a health issue. We assume that then corporations are held responsible, the security risk will be more effective as a motivator, and when individuals are held responsible, the health risk will be more effective. Situational barriers. The final question our model relates to is how to mitigate the gap between intention and actual behavior in regards to climate change. We assume that shedding a spotlight on situational barriers will make people more aware of them and help them imagine them more clearly. This will presumably lessen the gap between intentions and behavior, specifically in the context of climate change. We conducted a preliminary study asking how the public perceives the question of responsibility to examine to what degrees this is an issue in regards to taking action on climate change. Our first question addressed the extent of the responsibility of each group, government, industry, and individuals on climate change. Most of the participants, 84%, say that industry is responsible for climate change to a very large degree, and 70% hold the government responsible, with 59% feelings that the public is responsible for climate change. Our second question asks which of this same group has primary responsibility for climate change. More than 3/4 of the participants place the primary responsibility on industry, on 65% say that primary responsibility is on governments. 34% hold the citizen as primary responsible for climate change. And our third question, relating to the population in Israel, where the survey took place, was on the effect of campaigns on behavioral change. Most of the public feels that information campaigns didn't influence the public or industries in limiting their activities to minimize the damages of climate change. And our fourth question was on the extent campaigns have on industries in limiting their activities to contribute to climate change. Most of the public feels that information campaigns did not influence the public or industries in limiting their activities to minimize the damages of climate change. In order to examine the model, we propose an experiment with the public that, as you can see in the chart on the slide, examines the four variables: responsibility, security framing versus the health threat framing, transmitted information top-down versus bottom-up, and the salience of situational factors before examining behavior intentions. The idea here is to present the variables in narrative form. In each narrative, we change one of the variables to examine which is more effective. As you can see in this example, we change the top-down variables versus the bottom-up one, leaving the other variables as is. And then we can examine which variable has more impact. As in any research, we need to back it up with before and after data, which we plan to do using questionnaire. Our questions will relate to the type of people that suggest how to cope with climate change, identify social norms of people who take actions to reduce climate change damages. We'll examine trust in governments and political and economical viewpoints, and the extent governments uphold their commitments to the topic. And finally, we'll include behavioral intentions and actual behavior before and after the experimental manipulation using questions such as your willingness or unwillingness to support organizations working to protect the environment, or volunteering and participating in the actual activities. So I hope this gives you a good grasp of what we are planning to do. To conclude, we believe that this model will provide information on how to create communication strategies to motivate the public to action rather than simply examine viewpoints or behavioral intentions. The findings will help build a communication infrastructure targeting various subgroups in the population. The findings will also help identify variables that affect behavior both on the individual level and on the degree the public has on influencing corporations. Thank you very much for listening.